Is the delivery guy lost, or did someone invite him to the deal table? The laughter spread across the glass-walled boardroom like a ripple across still water, subtle at first, then louder, more confident, echoing against polished oak and chrome. 12 executives sat around a long conference table on the 42nd floor overlooking downtown Chicago, each dressed in tailored suits, crisp shirts, and quiet signals of power. And then there was him. A black man in a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers stepped inside without hesitation, his hands resting casually in his pockets as if he belonged to the skyline itself. No briefcase. No assistant. No introduction. Just quiet presence. The head of strategy leaned toward the CFO, barely lowering his voice. This is a closed meeting. Another executive smirked. Maybe he's IT. A few chuckles followed, polite but unmistakable. The man in the hoodie didn't react. He didn't slow down either. He walked the length of the room, past leather chairs and neatly stacked documents, past screens displaying acquisition forecasts and valuation charts, until he reached the final open seat at the far end of the table. He pulled the chair back and sat down. Calmly. Deliberately. Like someone who had done this 100 times before. The chairman, Richard Holloway, adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his tone measured but firm, "this is a private acquisition meeting." The man nodded once, as if acknowledging a weather report. He placed a slim phone on the table, folded his hands, and looked toward the large screen showing the company logo. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. The room shifted. Executives exchanged glances. Someone tapped a pen against a legal pad. The VP of operations leaned forward. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong room." Still nothing. The man in the hoodie remained composed, his posture relaxed but grounded, like someone anchored beneath the surface. Outside the windows, traffic crawled along Lake Shore Drive, tiny lines of red and white lights moving beneath the skyline, but inside the boardroom the air tightened, heavy with assumption. A junior analyst. Near the door studied the agenda, then glanced at the attendee list. His eyes flickered for a second before he looked back down, unsure. Meanwhile, the CFO whispered again, louder this time. "We're about to finalize a $200 million deal and we've got a guy in a hoodie sitting in." A few more laughs followed, sharper now. The chairman leaned back, patience thinning. "Security will escort you out if necessary," he said calmly. The man finally looked up. Not defensive. Not offended. Just steady. His eyes moved slowly across the table, one executive at a time, as if memorizing faces. Then he leaned back slightly, hands still folded, calm as ever. The laughter faded, replaced by a strange quiet that no one in the room could quite explain, because while they saw a man in a hoodie, the confidence he carried felt heavier than any tailored suit in the room. The chairman studied him for another second, waiting for discomfort, waiting for hesitation, but the man in the hoodie remained still, as if the tension in the room simply did not apply to him. Richard Holloway exhaled slowly and glanced toward his assistant near the door. "Can we confirm attendance?" he asked. The assistant nodded and stepped forward, tablet in hand, reading quietly down the list of expected participants. One by one, the names matched the faces around the table, senior partners, board members, outside consultants, all carefully selected for this acquisition meeting scheduled at 9:30 sharp on a Monday morning. The man in the hoodie did not appear on the printed list, at least not where she expected. She hesitated, scrolling again, her brow tightening slightly before she stepped back without comment. The silence stretched. The vice president of finance leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We are on a tight schedule," he said. "We have investors dialing in from New York in 15 minutes." A few heads nodded. Another executive adjusted his watch and added, "We should start." The chairman turned back toward the man in the hoodie. "Sir, if you are not part of this meeting, we will need you to step outside." The man tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational. Just calm, as if he had heard the same request many times before. He glanced at the large screen again, reviewing the projected numbers, projected growth, projected value, then rested his gaze on the documents in front of him. He reached forward and gently slid one folder closer, scanning the top page as though it belonged to him. The chief operating officer frowned. "Those are confidential." The man nodded once, still reading. A quiet murmur moved around the table. The junior analyst near the door looked again at the digital list, scrolling deeper this time, his fingers slowing as he reached the bottom. He noticed a name appended to the investor group, not under board members, not under consultants, but under acquisition authority. He read it once, then again, unsure if he had misunderstood. Meanwhile, the chief legal officer leaned forward, voice tightening. "This is a private negotiation. We cannot proceed with unauthorized individuals present." The man in the hoodie placed the folder back down exactly where he found it, aligning the edges carefully. He folded his hands again. Outside the windows, the morning sun reflected off the glass towers, casting thin streaks of light across the table, and for a moment the room felt suspended, like everyone was waiting for something none of them could name. The vice president of strategy gave a small laugh, trying to break the tension. "Maybe he is early for the next meeting." A few smiles returned, though weaker now. The man did not react. His calm began to feel deliberate, almost strategic, like he was allowing the room to reveal itself. The chairman finally signaled toward the assistant again, his patience wearing thin. "Please call building security." The assistant hesitated, glancing once more at her tablet, then back at the man in the hoodie. Something about the way he sat, composed, unbothered, made the request feel premature, but she nodded and stepped toward the door anyway. Before she could reach it, the man calmly reached for his phone, tapped the screen once, and placed it back on the table, his expression unchanged, as if he had just moved a single piece on a board no one else realized they were playing. The assistant paused near the door, her hand hovering just inches from the handle, when the chief operating officer leaned forward again, his voice now edged with impatience. "We are not going to sit here all morning," he said, glancing at the wall clock that read 9:38. The chairman nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. The man in the hoodie remained still, his eyes drifting toward the skyline as if the conversation unfolding around him was simply background noise. The chief legal officer shifted in his seat. "This is becoming disruptive," she said carefully. "We have shareholders waiting." The man finally turned his gaze back to the table, calm and steady, his expression unchanged. Across from him, the vice president of strategy leaned toward a colleague and whispered, though not quietly enough, "He has not said a word. That alone tells you he does not belong here." A few muted chuckles followed, though the confidence behind them had faded. The junior analyst near the door looked down again at his tablet, scrolling once more, his heartbeat picking up as he stared at the name he had just seen. He read it slowly, then checked the acquisition structure on the second page. His eyes widened slightly, but he hesitated, unsure whether to speak. Meanwhile, the chairman cleared his throat. "Sir, this is your final request. If you are not part of this negotiation, you need to step outside." The man in the hoodie tilted his head slightly, then leaned back in his chair, crossing one ankle over the other with unhurried confidence. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply stayed seated. The room tightened again. The chief operating officer sighed loudly. "Call security," he said, more firmly this time. The assistant nodded and reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway opened softly. Footsteps approached, measured and professional. Two individuals in tailored suits stepped into view, carrying slim leather folders, their expressions composed and focused. They paused briefly at the entrance, scanning the room, then walked in without hesitation. The executives glanced at one another, confused. The chairman frowned. "Can we help you?" he asked. One of the suited individuals offered a polite nod. "We are here for the 9:30 acquisition review," he said calmly. The chairman looked puzzled. "We already have everyone we need." The man in the hoodie did not move, but his eyes shifted toward the newcomers, calm as ever. The junior analyst swallowed, glancing again at the name on his tablet, then at the man in the hoodie, then back at the suited individuals. Something was aligning, piece by piece, though the rest of the room had not realized it yet. The vice president of finance leaned forward. "Who invited them?" he asked quietly. The suited individuals stepped closer to the table, placing their folders gently in front of the man in the hoodie, then taking seats beside him without asking permission. The room fell silent. The chairman's expression hardened slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone now cautious. "Who exactly are you here to represent?" The man in the hoodie finally moved, placing his hand lightly on the folder in front of him, his calm presence filling the room in a way no one could ignore anymore, as if the balance of power had shifted without a single raised voice. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and unmistakable, like pressure changing before a storm. The chairman's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the two suited individuals settle beside the man in the hoodie, their movements calm and deliberate, as though they had entered a space already familiar to them. One of them slid a folder forward, aligning it carefully in front of the man, then folded his hands. The other opened a tablet, tapping once before resting it flat on the polished wood. The executives exchanged glances, confusion growing heavier with every second. The vice president of finance leaned toward the chairman and whispered, "Do we know them?" The chairman shook his head slowly, his attention fixed on the man in the hoodie, who now rested his palm lightly on the folder as if acknowledging its presence without urgency. The junior analyst near the door felt his pulse quicken as he stared at the name again on his tablet. The letters now impossible to ignore. He swallowed and leaned slightly toward the assistant standing beside him. "Check the acquisition authority section," he whispered quietly. The assistant frowned, scrolling quickly, her eyes widening as she reached the final page. She looked up at the man in the hoodie, then back down at the screen, then again at the name. Meanwhile, the chief operating officer cleared his throat. "This meeting is restricted," he said, his tone firm but uncertain. One of the suited individuals finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "We understand. That is why we are here." The chairman leaned forward. "And you represent?" The suited man gestured subtly toward the man in the hoodie. "We represent him." The words landed softly but carried weight, like a stone dropped into still water. A quiet ripple passed around the table. The vice president of strategy frowned. "Represent him for what?" The second suited individual opened his tablet and turned it slightly, though not enough for the entire table to see. "For the acquisition," he replied calmly. The chairman's expression tightened. "We already have an acquisition team." The suited man nodded once. "Yes," he said. "You do." The silence deepened again. The junior analyst shifted his weight, his uncertainty turning into realization. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cautious. "Sir," he said to the chairman, "there is an additional authority listed under the investor group." The chairman looked toward him, irritated. "What authority?" The analyst hesitated, then read the name quietly. The chairman's brow furrowed, unfamiliar at first, until the suited individual slid the folder gently forward. The man in the hoodie finally lifted the folder, opening it with calm precision. Papers inside reflected the morning light, crisp and official. He scanned the first page, then closed it again without comment. The chairman leaned back slightly, his confidence thinning. "I think there has been some confusion," he said carefully. The man in the hoodie finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, and unhurried, as if every word had been measured long before he entered the room. "No," he said quietly. "There has not." The executives exchanged uneasy glances as the balance in the room continued to shift, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through the quiet presence of a man who had never needed to prove he belonged. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected, stretching across the polished table as executives shifted in their seats, each trying to interpret what had just happened. The chairman adjusted his posture, forcing a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Then perhaps you would like to clarify," he said carefully, his tone controlled but edged with caution. The man in the hoodie rested his hands lightly on the closed folder, his fingers relaxed, his expression calm. He did not rush. He did not fill the silence. He allowed it to grow, and in that quiet, discomfort began to settle around the table. The chief operating officer leaned forward, impatience returning to his voice. "With all due respect, we are finalizing a $200 million acquisition. We do not have time for confusion." The suited individual beside the man in the hoodie glanced at him briefly, then looked back at the executives. "There is no confusion," he said calmly. The vice president of strategy let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced now. "Then explain why none of us have heard of this." The man in the hoodie finally opened the folder again, flipping one page with measured precision, his movements unhurried, controlled, deliberate. The room watched him now, every eye fixed on the quiet man who had not raised his voice once since entering. The junior analyst leaned closer to the assistant, whispering again, "That is him." The assistant swallowed, her eyes moving from the tablet to the man in the hoodie, then back again. The chairman noticed their exchange. "What is it?" he asked sharply. The assistant hesitated, unsure whether to speak, but before she could respond, the chief legal officer leaned forward, her tone sharper. "If there is additional authority involved, we should have been informed in advance." The man in the hoodie closed the folder again and placed it gently on the table. "You were informed," he said quietly. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. The vice president of finance frowned. "We reviewed every document." The suited individual beside him slid a second document across the table, stopping just short of the chairman. "Page 32, he said calmly. The chairman hesitated, then pulled the document closer, flipping to the indicated page. His expression shifted slightly, the confidence in his posture loosening just enough to be noticed. The executives leaned in, watching him read. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the skyline outside had moved closer to the glass. The chairman read the line once, then again, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The vice president of strategy leaned toward him. "What does it say?" The chairman did not answer immediately. The man in the hoodie leaned back slightly, his calm unchanged, his presence steady. The chief operating officer cleared his throat, tension creeping into his voice. "Is there a problem?" The chairman finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral, but the shift was unmistakable. "There appears to be an additional acquisition authority," he said slowly. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. The vice president of finance asked quietly, "Who?" The chairman's eyes moved toward the man in the hoodie, lingering for a second longer than before, as the realization began to settle, slow and undeniable, across the room. The chairman's gaze remained fixed on the man in the hoodie, the weight of realization settling slowly across his face as the room fell into a deeper silence than before. The vice president of finance leaned forward, his voice cautious now. "Who is the additional authority?" he asked again, softer this time. The chairman did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back down at the document, then toward the suited individuals, then finally back to the man in the hoodie. The shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. Confidence had turned into caution. The man in the hoodie remained relaxed, leaning slightly back in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the table as if the entire moment had unfolded exactly as expected. Outside, sunlight reflected across the glass buildings, casting thin streaks of brightness across the room, but inside, the air felt heavier with every passing second. The chief operating officer cleared his throat. "Richard, what does the document say?" he asked, impatience now replaced by unease. The chairman exhaled slowly. "It lists Whitmore Capital as final acquisition authority," he said carefully. The name landed quietly, but the reaction around the table was immediate. Several executives exchanged confused looks. The vice president of strategy frowned. Whitmore Capital. They were only minority investors. One of the suited individuals spoke calmly. That was before this morning. The chief legal officer leaned forward, her tone tightening. That is not possible. Any controlling interest would require board notification. The suited individual nodded slightly. Which was filed at 8:47 this morning. The junior analyst quickly checked his tablet again, scrolling through the updated filings. His eyes widened as the timestamp appeared. It is here, he said quietly, almost to himself. The room shifted again. The chairman looked at the man in the hoodie, his expression now cautious. And you represent Whitmore Capital? He asked. The suited individual answered first. We do. The chairman nodded slowly, then looked back at the man in the hoodie. And your role? The man finally leaned forward, his movements calm and deliberate, his eyes steady as they moved across the table, meeting each executive's gaze without urgency. I authorized the acquisition, he said quietly. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. The vice president of finance sat back in his chair. The chief operating officer blinked, trying to process the statement. The vice president of strategy shook his head slightly, still resisting the implication. You authorized it, he repeated. The man nodded once. The suited individual beside him opened another document and slid it forward, stopping it near the chairman. Signed at 8:45 this morning, he said calmly. The chairman glanced down at the signature, then back up at the man in the hoodie. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. The balance had moved. No. One laughed now. No one whispered. The executives who had questioned him earlier sat quietly, watching the man who had entered without introduction, who had remained silent while they doubted him, who now sat at the table with quiet authority that no tailored suit could match. The man in the hoodie leaned back slightly again, his calm unchanged, as the realization continued to spread across the room, slow and undeniable, like daylight filling a space that had been shadowed only moments before. No one spoke for several seconds after the document landed on the table, the quiet now heavier than before, as if the entire room had been forced to reconsider everything that had happened in the last 10 minutes. The chairman slowly set the document down, his eyes lingering on the signature before shifting back to the man in the hoodie. You authorized the controlling acquisition, he repeated carefully, as though saying it aloud might somehow change the reality. The man nodded once, calm and unbothered, his posture unchanged. The vice president of strategy leaned forward, his earlier confidence now replaced with uncertainty. Then who exactly are you? He asked, the question finally spoken aloud. The room turned toward the man in the hoodie, every executive waiting. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the skyline again, sunlight reflecting across the glass towers, then back at the table. He reached for the folder once more and slid a single sheet forward, stopping it at the center of the table. The suited individual beside him turned the paper toward the chairman. The chairman leaned in, reading the header, his expression shifting again, this time more visibly. The chief operating officer watched him closely. Richard, he asked quietly. The chairman exhaled slowly. Darius Whitmore, he read aloud, the name settling into the room like a quiet announcement that changed everything. Several executives froze. The vice president of finance blinked, recognition dawning slowly. Whitmore Capital, he murmured. The junior analyst nodded quietly, almost relieved that someone else had said it first. The man in the hoodie finally spoke again, his voice steady and calm. Yes, he said. The chief legal officer straightened in her chair. You are Darius Whitmore, she asked carefully. He nodded once. The silence that followed felt different now, no longer uncertain, but reflective, as each person in the room replayed the last few minutes in their mind, the laughter, the assumptions, the quiet dismissal. The vice president of strategy leaned back slowly, his earlier smirk gone. You were not listed as attending, he said quietly. Darius rested his hands lightly on the table. "I prefer to attend quietly," he replied. The chairman studied him for another moment, the shift in tone now unmistakable. "You now hold controlling interest," he said, more statement than question. Darius nodded once. The suited individual beside him added calmly, 51% as of this morning. The room absorbed the number in silence. The chief operating officer glanced around the table, then back at Darius. "So this deal," he began, trailing off. Darius leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Is no longer under discussion," he said. The words landed softly, but their meaning was immediate. The executives exchanged glances again, their earlier certainty replaced by quiet realization. The man they had questioned, the man they had nearly asked to leave, now sat at the head of the decision itself. Darius leaned back again, composed, his calm presence filling the room as the balance of power settled fully into place. The room remained still as Darius Whitmore's words settled across the table, the weight of finality replacing the earlier uncertainty. The chief operating officer leaned back slowly, his fingers interlocked, as if trying to process the shift that had unfolded in less than 15 minutes. The vice president of finance glanced at the projections still glowing on the screen, numbers that had driven the conversation only moments ago, now suddenly irrelevant. The chairman cleared his throat quietly, the authority in his voice tempered with caution. "Then what is your position moving forward?" he asked. Darius rested his hands lightly on the table, his expression calm and composed. "We proceed," he said simply. The vice president of strategy frowned slightly. "Proceed how?" Darius looked toward the screen, then back at the executives. "With new leadership expectations," he replied. The words were measured, but their meaning was unmistakable. A quiet tension returned, not confrontational, but reflective. The chief legal officer leaned forward, her tone careful. "You intend to restructure?" Darius nodded once. The suited individual beside him opened another document and slid it toward the chairman. "Updated governance structure," he said calmly. The chairman reviewed the document, his expression tightening slightly as he read the revised leadership roles. The vice president of finance leaned closer, trying to see the changes. The junior analyst watched the shift unfold, his earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet understanding. Darius remained composed, allowing the room to absorb the information at its own pace. The chief operating officer finally spoke. "This is effective immediately?" he asked. Darius nodded once. The suited individual confirmed. "Effective as of this morning." The room absorbed the statement in silence. The vice president of strategy looked down at the table, replaying the earlier laughter in his mind, the casual dismissal, the quiet assumptions. No one spoke about it, but everyone remembered. The chairman placed the document back on the table and looked at Darius, his tone now respectful. "Understood," he said. Darius leaned back slightly, calm as ever, his presence steady. Outside, the morning light continued to reflect across the skyline, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The man who had entered quietly now guided the direction of the conversation without raising his voice. The chief legal officer nodded slowly, already adjusting her notes. The vice president of finance straightened his posture. The chief operating officer folded his hands, waiting. The balance of the room had changed completely. Darius glanced once more around the table, meeting each executive's gaze calmly, not with confrontation, but with quiet authority that made further resistance unnecessary. The suited individual beside him closed his folder, signaling completion. The executive sat in silence for another moment, the transformation complete, as the man in the hoodie who had entered without introduction now sat as the controlling voice in the room. No one reached for their phones and no one interrupted as the quiet settled into something deeper, more reflective, as if the room itself understood that the moment had shifted beyond numbers and contracts. Darius Whitmore remained seated for another second, calm and composed, his gaze moving slowly across the table, meeting each face that had laughed, questioned, and doubted him only minutes earlier. The chairman straightened slightly, his tone measured but respectful. "We will move forward under your direction," he said. Darius nodded once, acknowledging the statement without ceremony. The chief operating officer adjusted his posture, his earlier confidence replaced with professional restraint. The vice president of strategy closed his notebook quietly, no longer eager to lead the conversation. The transformation was complete. Darius finally rose from his chair, his movements unhurried, the hoodie that once drew attention now irrelevant compared to the authority he carried. He gathered the folder in front of him and paused, looking once more at the skyline beyond the glass walls. The city moved below, traffic flowing, sunlight reflecting across towers, everything unchanged outside, yet inside the boardroom, everything had shifted. He turned back toward the table, his voice calm, steady, and deliberate. "You did not laugh because of the numbers," he said quietly. The executives remained silent. "You laughed because of what you thought you saw." The word settled across the table, not harsh, not accusatory, but undeniable. The vice president of finance lowered his gaze slightly. The chief legal officer sat still, listening. Darius continued, his tone even. "A hoodie. No introduction. No title." He paused briefly. "And you decided I did not belong." The room remained silent, the earlier laughter now distant and uncomfortable. Darius looked around once more, calm as ever. "Real leadership does not always walk in wearing a tailored suit," he said quietly. "Sometimes it walks in quietly. And lets the room reveal itself." The chairman nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind the words. Darius rested the folder under his arm and stepped back from the table. "We move forward," he said calmly. The suited individuals gathered their documents and stood beside him. The executives remained seated, watching as he walked toward the door, the same calm presence that had entered now leaving with quiet authority. As he reached the doorway, he paused briefly, glancing back at the table one final time. "Next time," he said quietly, "listen before you judge." Then he stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the boardroom in reflective silence, as the executives sat still, not because they had been told to, but because they understood that the man they had doubted had not raised his voice, had not demanded respect, yet had redefined it completely in less than 15 minutes.